Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. I started trucking when I was 21, still trying to figure out who I was and where I fit in the world. I'd taken a break from school because I was restless. I wanted to see things, do something that didn't feel like sitting in a classroom staring at a whiteboard. The open road had always fascinated me. Those endless lines stretching toward the horizon, the hum of diesel engines echoing at truck stops. The idea of being completely alone, yet somehow connected to everything. So I went to truck driving school, got my CDL, and within months I was hauling freight across the country. It wasn't glamorous. Anyone who tells you trucking is glamorous hasn't spent a night sleeping, in a cab parked behind a Walmart, or tried to eat breakfast from a vending machine at 3 a.m., but it gave me stories, and one of them still sits with me. This one happened in Colorado sometime in the spring. I was driving north toward Pueblo, hauling a fairly light load in a day cab with a single trailer. It was my first real time going through the Rocky Mountains, and I was nervous about it. I'd heard all the horror stories. Guys missing a downshift on a steep grade, losing control, brakes overheating, even runaway rigs slamming into barriers or worse. Those mountains don't play around, especially if you don't know how to handle them. That morning, the sky was overcast but calm, the air cold enough that I could see my breath when I stopped to check my tires before the climb. The snow was mostly gone, except for a thin dusting on the ridges and shady stretches of road. It looked peaceful in that deceptive mountain way. Quiet, wide open. The kind of calm that hides how fast things can turn bad if you're not careful. I eased into the incline slow and steady, hazard lights on, keeping to the right lane. My truck was humming, the engine brakes set low, RPMs holding steady. Every time I looked in the mirror, I could see the long ribbon of mountain road behind me curving down into the valley. And beyond that, the pale sky meeting the peaks. At one point, maybe halfway up the grade, I passed another truck parked on the shoulder. It wasn't unusual. Sometimes drivers pull off to cool their brakes, check something, or take a break before the downhill. It was a red Peterbilt with a white trailer, a bit of soot on the exhaust stacks. Looked like a seasoned rig. I didn't think twice about it. Just another driver doing his thing. By the time I crested the top, the air had gotten colder. You could feel it through the vents, a sharp chill that slipped under your collar. The road started to tilt downward, that long, steady descent that demands your full attention. If you've never been behind the wheel of a fully loaded 18-wheeler on a mountain grade, it's hard to explain the tension. Every little thing you do matters. The gear you pick, how much you touch the brakes, how you read the curve ahead. There's no forgiveness if you screw it up. I kept my speed low, engine brake humming, eyes flicking between the mirrors, the gauges, and the road. I remember how my hands felt on the wheel. Tight, dry, a little sweaty even though it was cold. The smell of hot rubber and diesel mixed faintly in the cab. Somewhere halfway down, maybe near one of those runaway truck ramps, I saw headlights in my mirror. They were coming fast, weaving slightly, the glare bouncing as they hit bumps in the road. I thought it might be a car, maybe someone impatient, but then I saw the outline. It was a tractor trailer. At first, I figured he must have lost his gear and was trying to regain control, but then I saw it more clearly. It was the same red Peterbilt I'd passed earlier, the one that had been parked on the shoulder. And it wasn't just going fast. It was flying, shot past me in the left lane like a comet, the engine howling. What hit me hardest, though, was the sight of his brakes. They were glowing orange. I mean literally glowing. Flames licking around the wheels, trailing sparks and smoke as he tore downhill. His trailer was sealed tight, meaning he was hauling something. But whatever it was, it didn't matter anymore. Those brakes were gone. It's hard to explain the feeling you get when you see something like that. There's this gut-level dread that just anchors itself in you. Every instinct screams that what you're looking at shouldn't be happening. I remember the sound, The screech of metal under stress, the roar of the tires, the high-pitched whine that comes from brakes that have stopped doing their job. It was chaos moving downhill at 80 miles an hour. For a few seconds, I just watched, my jaw locked, my heart hammering. My brain couldn't even process how he was still upright. His trailer was fishtailing slightly, glowing embers spinning off the wheels as they disintegrated. The mountain air was filled with the smell of burning rubber and metal, and even through my closed windows, I could smell it. I grabbed my CB mic, my voice shaking. I yelled into it that his brakes were on fire. I didn't think, just reacted. It's what you do when you see another driver in trouble. The static crackled for a second before a voice came through, calm and slow, almost unnervingly so. He said he knew. That was it, no panic, no yelling, just that. And then he was gone. I watched him round a curve and vanish into the tree line, the glow of his brakes fading behind the bend. For the next several miles, I drove slower than ever, heart pounding. I kept expecting to see a wreck around every corner, a pile of twisted metal, trailer split open, maybe fire crews or flashing lights. Nothing, just the winding road, the guardrails and the mountains stretching out in front of me. The descent felt endless. The grade seemed to go on forever, every turn feeding into another. I started to doubt myself. Maybe he'd managed to stop somehow. Maybe he'd used a runaway ramp and I just hadn't noticed. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I'd seen the speed he was going. You don't walk away from that. When I finally reached the base of the mountain, the road leveled out and widened. There was a small pull-off area with gravel and a view of the valley. I eased my truck over to check my brakes and catch my breath. My hands were still trembling on the wheel. That's when I noticed it. A red fire extinguisher lying on its side in the dirt near the edge of the pull-off. The pin was gone. The nozzle blackened slightly like it had been used. It was too clean to have been sitting there long. I got out and walked over, boots crunching against the gravel. The air smelled faintly of burnt rubber and smoke, carried faintly by the wind. The extinguisher didn't have any markings I could see, but something about it made my stomach twist. No wreck, no broken guardrail, no signs of an accident. Just that extinguisher sitting there like some kind of quiet reminder that whatever had happened up there, it was over now. I stood there for a while, watching the highway curve back into the mountains. A few cars passed by, a couple of other trucks grinding their way down, their brake lights glowing red as they eased through the grade. Everything looked normal again, peaceful even, but I couldn't shake the image of that red Peterbilt flying down the mountain, flames trailing from its wheels like a burning fuse. The way that voice had sounded over the radio, steady, calm, like someone who'd already accepted what was coming. I got back in my truck eventually, finished my run and moved on. But every time I've driven through mountain passes since then, Utah, Wyoming, Oregon, I've thought about him, about how close the line really is between control and disaster out there. People don't realize how much trust trucking takes. You trust your rig, your brakes, the grade signs, the weather reports. You trust that other drivers know what they're doing too. But sometimes something breaks and there's no time to fix it. Sometimes all you can do is hold on. I've told that story a few times over the years. Most folks just shake their heads or say maybe he made it. Maybe he used a ramp. Maybe the extinguisher wasn't his. I'd like to believe that too. But I've been on enough roads to know better. I think he knew his brakes were gone long before I ever saw him. I think he made a choice to ride it out. Maybe try to make it to the bottom, maybe just not panic and cause more harm. Whatever it was, he stayed calm until the end. That's the part that sticks with me most. There's something about the mountains that humbles you. They don't care how skilled you are or how many miles you've logged. They remind you that you're small, that all it takes is one mistake or one bad moment for everything to go wrong. Every time I drive through Colorado, I still slow down a little more than I need to. I keep my hazards on longer. I check my brakes twice. I glance at every turnout, every ramp, every shoulder. And every now and then, when I reach the bottom of a long grade and see a pull-off or a fire extinguisher lying forgotten in the gravel, I think about that driver and the way his truck burned like a falling star against the mountainside. I never saw his name, never found a report, never heard another driver mention it. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe he made it, maybe he didn't. But either way, he's part of those roads now. Part of the long stories the Rockies keep, quiet and endless, waiting for the next driver to pass through and wonder. Even now, years later, I can still picture the glow of his wheels cutting through the dark, the way the fire streaked behind him, swallowed by the curve. It's the kind of sight that never really leaves you. And every time I start down a steep mountain road and feel that gravity pull against the weight of the trailer, I hear that quiet, steady voice echo in my head, calm as ever. I know. It was January of 1994 when this happened, though I can still picture it clearly, like it was yesterday. Back then, I was running long hauls out west, the kind of work where you lived out of the cab for weeks and counted miles instead of days. I'd been hauling a load down near Riverside, California. It was a simple run, nothing unusual, and by the time I'd dropped off the trailer, it was late afternoon. Dispatch called me and told me I could lay over in a hotel for the night, all on company expense. That almost never happened back then. Usually you'd be told to sleep in your cab or find a cheap spot at a rest area, so hearing that felt like winning a small lottery. I remember checking into a modest little place just off the highway. Nothing fancy. A single-story motel with faded paint and that old desert dust baked into everything. The air outside still held a bit of warmth from the day, and I remember the neon sign buzzing, flickering slightly, like it was trying too hard to stay alive. I parked the rig where I could keep an eye on it from my room window, locked up, and grabbed my overnight bag. Inside, the room smelled faintly like cleaning chemicals mixed with cigarette smoke that never really went away. I didn't care, though. The bed looked decent and the shower had decent pressure. That was all a driver could ask for. I remember sitting down in front of the small TV, ordering a simple dinner from the diner next door: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and a cup of black coffee. I felt relaxed for once. I had my shoes off, my belt undone, and some half-interesting movie was playing on the TV. I don't even remember what it was about, but it was enough to keep my mind quiet after days of driving. I was about halfway through my dinner when the phone in the room rang. It was dispatch. They told me there'd been a change in plans. A new pickup needed to be made up in Salt Lake City early the next morning, and they wanted me to deadhead, run empty, all the way up that night. I remember feeling that familiar wave of frustration. That was the job, though. You didn't argue, not unless you wanted to be sitting idle for a week waiting for the next load. So I sighed, packed everything back up, checked out, and got on the road again. The night stretched ahead of me, the dark ribbon of I-15 winding north. The headlights carved out a narrow tunnel of visibility, while the rest of the desert fell away into blackness. There's a certain rhythm you get into after years behind the wheel. The hum of the engine, the faint vibration through the steering column, and the static crackle from the CB radio. All of it blends into something that feels almost like meditation. I rolled through the Mojave, past the lonely gas stations and the little towns where the lights seemed to cling to the ground like scattered embers. I stopped once near Barstow for coffee and to stretch my legs. The air was cold, dry, and carried that distinct scent of the desert: dust, fuel, and the faint trace of something metallic. I remember looking up at the sky, the stars so sharp and clear that they almost didn't look real. It felt like I was the only person out there, just me and the highway. I got back in the truck, pushed north, and didn't stop again until I rolled into St. George. Early in the morning. The sun wasn't up yet, but the sky had started to turn that pale blue that comes before dawn. I pulled into a truck stop on the edge of town, one of those older ones with faded signage and a gravel lot that popped under your tires. The place was quiet, maybe 2 or 3 other rigs parked off to the side. The air was cold enough that my breath came out in pale clouds. I shut off the engine, stepped down from the cab, and went around to start fueling. Now, every driver has their own little routine for fueling. Mine was simple. I'd put the nozzle in, set the latch to keep it running, then let it fill while I stood by, watching the numbers climb. I'd done it thousands of times, but this time, something strange happened. I had just put the nozzle into the first tank on the driver's side and set it to pump. I leaned against the side of the truck, rubbing my hands together to keep warm. The pump hummed steadily, that low, constant thrum that becomes background noise after a while. Then all of a sudden the hose jerked violently, like someone had yanked it. It jumped out of the tank and started spraying diesel everywhere, on me, on the side of the truck, on the ground. For a second, I just froze. It startled me so bad that I didn't even move right away. Then I jumped forward, grabbed it, and slammed it back down to shut it off. My clothes were soaked through with diesel. The smell was so strong it almost made my eyes water. My hands were slick, and I could feel the cold bite through the wet fabric. It didn't make sense. That had never happened to me before, not once. The latch on those nozzles is designed to hold steady, unless something physically pulls it out. I checked the handle, the hose, the tank opening. Everything looked fine. I remember standing there, staring at the ground where the puddle of fuel shimmered in the faint light of the overhead lamps. My boots made squelching sounds as I shifted my feet. The air was sharp with the smell of diesel, mixed now with the damp, cold morning air. I finished fueling the other side, slower this time, keeping a hand on the nozzle the entire way. I was irritated and cold, but more than that, I was confused. I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it wasn't right. Inside the truck stop, I got my shower ticket. The clerk barely looked at me when I walked in, though I must have reeked of diesel. The showers were down a narrow hallway, the kind lined with tile that echoed every sound. The water was hot, and I stood under it for a long time, scrubbing the smell out of my hair, out of my skin. Diesel doesn't come off easy, and it leaves your clothes useless after it soaks in. I threw mine into the little washer-dryer setup they had there and waited, sitting in one of those hard plastic chairs by the vending machines. By the time I got back on the road, it was morning. The sun was coming up over the Red Rock Hills around St. George, lighting them up in that soft orange glow that makes the whole desert look like it's on fire. My truck still smelled faintly of fuel, and I kept the windows cracked to keep the air fresh. The rest of the drive was quiet. Utah can be beautiful in the early hours. Endless stretches of open land, the horizon rising and falling gently, mountains off in the distance catching the morning light. I kept thinking about what had happened at the fuel stop. I replayed it in my head, trying to come up with a reason. Maybe there'd been air pressure in the tank, or the nozzle had a faulty latch. But even then, it didn't quite fit. It had jumped too hard, too sudden, like something had actually yanked it. I couldn't make sense of it, but I forced myself to let it go. By late morning, I rolled into Salt Lake City. The streets were quieter than usual. I remember thinking that the city seemed oddly still, like the air itself felt heavier. When I got to the yard to check in for my pickup, the guy behind the counter looked at me like he'd seen a ghost. That's when I learned what had happened. The Northridge earthquake had hit California early that morning. Massive damage, hundreds injured, entire buildings down. The timing hit me all at once. I realized that if dispatch hadn't called and rerouted me north, I would have still been down in Riverside when it struck. I sat in the cab for a long while after that, just staring through the windshield. The thought made my stomach turn. I'd been only a few hours ahead of it, maybe less. Started thinking back to that moment in St. George, the fuel hose jumping free like it had a mind of its own. I couldn't help but wonder if it had been connected somehow. Like maybe that was the first sign, a ripple from something happening hundreds of miles away. But I'll never know for sure. Maybe it was pure coincidence. Maybe it was a pressure shift or a faulty latch. But I've fueled up thousands of times since then, all over the country, and it never happened again. Not once. For years after that, every time I passed through St. George, I'd think about that morning. I'd remember the cold diesel soaking my clothes, the smell clinging to my skin, the way the hose had snapped loose like it was alive. I'd think about how, while I was standing there cursing and wiping fuel off my face, the ground hundreds of miles away was beginning to tear open. Sometimes, when I parked the truck at night and the world went quiet around me, I'd think about how close I came to being down there when it hit. The world has its strange ways of rerouting us. Sometimes it's a phone call, sometimes a machine acting up. It was sometime around 3 in the morning, years ago, when I was running one of those meet-and-turn routes. For anyone who's never done one, it's basically when two truck drivers, each from different cities, drive halfway toward each other with their loads. We meet somewhere in between, usually in some empty lot or rest stop, switch trailers, and head back home. It's a routine that a lot of long-haul drivers get used to, because it keeps you close enough to home while still putting in your miles. I'd been doing the same route for a few months, and I knew every stretch of that highway by heart. The gas stations that were still open at that hour, the spots where the fog always seemed to roll in thickest, even the little diner that turned its lights off at exactly 2:30 every night. The meet point was nothing special, just a wide dirt lot that sat off the highway, surrounded by fields and a thin line of trees. There weren't any buildings nearby, just an old leaning sign half buried in weeds, and the hum of distant traffic that sometimes carried over from the interstate. It was quiet, too quiet most nights. When I'd pull in, there'd usually be no one else around. The other driver always ran about an hour behind me, so I'd use that time to recline across my seat and close my eyes for a bit. Those short naps were gold when you were driving nights. The engine would tick softly as it cooled, and the wind would whistle faintly through the cracks in the cab. That night didn't feel any different. It was cold. Late autumn, the kind where your breath fogs up the glass and the air feels heavy. I'd parked at my usual spot in the lot, facing the road so I could see headlights when the other guy arrived. I shut off the engine but left the parking lights on. There was something about the pitch black that always felt heavier out there, so I liked a little light. I reclined the seat, pulled my jacket over my chest, and closed my eyes. I must have only been asleep for 10 minutes when I started hearing it. A dog barking somewhere in the distance. At first it was faint, far off enough that it didn't bother me. I figured maybe there was a farmhouse nearby, or maybe some stray wandering around. Dogs bark at nothing all the time. I pulled the jacket over my head and tried to drift off again, but the barking kept on. After a few minutes it got louder, steadier. Not the normal random bark of a dog chasing shadows. This was rhythmic, insistent, almost like the animal was focused on something. Each bark seemed closer than the last, echoing across the lot. I remember thinking it was strange because I hadn't seen or heard another soul out there all night. There were no houses in sight, no other vehicles parked, nothing that would explain a dog wandering around at that hour. The sound started to get under my skin. It wasn't just the barking, it was the persistence of it. 10 minutes straight, never breaking rhythm, never stopping. It wasn't afraid or playful. It was angry. I lay there listening, hoping it would fade away, but instead it grew sharper, more intense, until I could tell the dog, or whatever it was right outside my truck. At that point I sat up, groggy but alert. The barking was coming from right next to the driver's side window, so loud that the glass was vibrating slightly with each sound. My first thought was that maybe it really was some stray gone mad, or maybe a guard dog from a nearby property that had wandered off. Either way, I didn't like the idea of it right outside the truck. I was annoyed more than anything. I figured I'd have to get out and throw something to scare it off. So I rubbed my face, leaned forward, and turned my head toward the window. And there he was. Not a dog, not even close. A man was standing there, inches from the glass, looking straight at me. His face was lit faintly by the parking lights, pale and wild-eyed. He had to be in his mid-30s, heavyset with a mess of dark hair that stuck to his forehead. His eyes were wide open, locked on mine, and his mouth was stretched into this unhinged snarl as he barked. Actually barked. Like an animal. Short, sharp bursts of sound that came from deep in his throat. I could see his lips curling back, spit spraying across the window. His teeth glinted wetly in the dim light, and there was foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. I froze. Every muscle in my body went rigid. My first thought wasn't even fear, it was confusion. My mind just couldn't process what I was seeing. There was no dog, no reason for any of this. Just a man standing outside my truck in the middle of nowhere, barking like a rabid animal. For a few long seconds, neither of us moved. He just kept barking, staring through the glass with this feverish intensity, his chest heaving with each sound. His eyes were unfocused, like he wasn't even seeing me, just reacting to something in his own head. His clothes were dirty, torn in places, and I could see the outline of mud or maybe blood smeared across his shirt. That's when the fear kicked in. I remember my hands trembling as I reached down slowly, trying not to make any sudden movement. I didn't want to set him off, didn't want him trying to open the door or break the window. I slid my hand over the ignition key and turned it as quietly as I could. The engine roared to life louder than I wanted, and the sound startled him for a split second, but then he lunged forward, slamming both hands against the window and barking even harder. His face pressed close enough that I could see the whites of his eyes. I threw the truck into gear and eased forward, trying not to spin the wheels in the loose dirt. He moved with me, keeping up for a few seconds, his hand smacking the side of the cab. Then he started running alongside, barking the whole time. It was surreal, watching this grown man chase my truck like some deranged animal, his arms pumping, his mouth wide open, still making those horrible sounds. I hit the gas harder, the truck bouncing over the uneven ground until I reached the paved road. When I glanced in the mirror, I saw him still standing there at the edge of the lot, watching me go. His chest was heaving, and he was still barking faintly, the sound growing smaller until it was swallowed by the hum of my tires on asphalt. I didn't stop until I was miles down the highway. My heart was still hammering, my palms slick with sweat. I kept checking the mirrors even though I knew he couldn't have followed me. There was no one out there but me and the dark, endless stretch of road ahead. When I finally reached the next truck stop, I pulled in under the floodlights and sat there for a while, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely light a cigarette. I kept replaying the image of that man's face in my mind. The crazed eyes, the foam at his mouth, the way he barked like it was the only sound he knew how to make. It didn't feel real, but it was. Every part of me knew it was. Later that morning, I mentioned it to the other driver when we finally crossed paths back at the depot. I didn't tell him everything, just said some weirdo had wandered up to my truck and scared me half to death. He laughed it off, said I'd probably run into some tweaker or drifter, which made sense. That area wasn't far from some smaller towns where you'd sometimes see folks walking along the highway, out of their minds on something. Still, it didn't explain how far out that lot was, or how the man ended up there in the middle of the night. There weren't any buildings, no signs of life for miles. For a few weeks, I kept doing the run, but I couldn't bring myself to nap anymore. I'd park with the doors locked tight and the windows up, the engine idling just enough to keep the heat on, watching the shadows beyond the headlights until the other driver arrived. I'd catch myself listening, half expecting to hear that barking again. Sometimes I thought I did, faintly, off in the distance, but I never went to check. Eventually, I got reassigned to a different route, one that didn't require meet points in the middle of nowhere. I didn't complain. I never told the company about that night. I don't even think I could have explained it right if I tried. But even now, years later, I still think about it sometimes. How long that man must have been out there before I woke up. How he found me in that empty lot. And what he would have done if I hadn't woken up when I did. That night changed something in me. I used to think the worst part of the road was the loneliness. The endless hours of nothing but asphalt and your own thoughts. But it's not the loneliness that gets to you. It's realizing that the most unpredictable thing out there isn't the weather, or the road, or even the wildlife. It's people. Since then, I've slept in my truck hundreds of times in different places, from gas stations to rest areas to the side of forgotten highways. But I never let myself drift off too deeply, not anymore. No matter how quiet it is or how safe it feels, part of me stays awake, listening. Because once you've opened your eyes in the middle of the night and seen a man standing inches from your window, barking at you like an animal, you never really sleep the same way again. I used to work as a delivery driver for a soft drink company in Alaska. My route took me all over the southern part of the state, from Anchorage to Palmer, Wasilla, sometimes as far out as Talkeetna. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough. And I liked the quiet mornings when the world was still waking up, when the air was sharp and cold, and the roads stretched ahead of me like frozen rivers through the wilderness. That particular morning started out like any other. It was late winter, the kind of season where the snowbanks were high enough to cover the bottoms of road signs, and the roads were still slick with ice in the early hours. I'd left the depot in Anchorage before dawn, loaded with pallets of soda, sports drinks, and those little energy drinks that came in metal cans. The cab heater was going full blast. The radio was barely audible over the hum of the engine, and my thermos of coffee sat wedged between the seat and the console. The first leg of the trip, heading north out of Anchorage toward the valley, was one I knew well. It's a stretch of road that can lull you into a rhythm if you're not careful. Long, empty miles broken up by patches of forest and frozen lakes, with the occasional car passing in the opposite lane, headlights cutting across the dim blue light of early morning. If you've never driven in Alaska, you might not understand just how big of a problem moose are. They're not like deer down south. A full-grown moose can be taller than the hood of a truck, and hitting one can kill you just as easily as it kills them. I'd seen my fair share of them over the years, standing on the shoulder of the road like they owned the place, crossing in slow motion while drivers waited, sometimes standing frozen in the middle of the highway, eyes glowing in the headlights like something out of a nightmare. It was around 6 in the morning when it happened. The sky was starting to brighten a bit, that dull gray blue that comes before sunrise. I was on one of the straighter stretches, not far from the Nick River Bridge, following behind a compact car that was keeping a steady speed. Everything felt routine, just another run. Then, out of nowhere, something dark and massive moved between the two of us. I barely had time to react. The car in front of me swerved hard to the left, tires screeching on the icy road, and suddenly a moose was right there, broad, brown, and filling my windshield. Instinct kicked in before thought. I slammed the brakes and jerked the wheel just enough to keep from rear-ending the car. The truck shuddered, the trailer fishtailing for a second before the weight settled. I felt a heavy thud against the right side of the front guard, loud enough to make my chest seize up, and then it was over. I remember gripping the steering wheel tight, heart pounding, staring at the road ahead. The moose was gone, just like that. It had come out of nowhere and disappeared into the trees beyond the shoulder. For a few seconds I sat there trying to process what happened, the smell of burnt rubber and cold air filling the cab. The car ahead of me had stopped for a moment too, its brake lights glowing red, but after a few seconds it kept going. I watched it disappear down the road. I climbed out for a quick look, but there wasn't much to see. The front moose guard had a fresh dent on the lower right side. A little bit of dark hair stuck to it, but no blood, no major damage. I figured I'd just clipped it in the back end. Enough to scare it off, but not enough to seriously injure it. I didn't feel good about it, but there wasn't anything else I could do. You can't exactly go chasing a moose into the woods, so I got back in and kept driving. For the next 30 minutes or so, everything seemed normal. The road wound through low hills and frozen marshes, and the sun finally began to push through the clouds, lighting up the snowbanks with that pale yellow glow. I remember thinking how quiet it was, the kind of quiet that only exists out there, when the world feels empty except for you, and the sound of your own tires on the pavement. Then people started honking at me. It began with a sedan that passed on my left, the driver giving a couple of quick honks before speeding ahead. I assumed it was just impatience. Maybe I'd drifted a little too far into the lane, or they were just the kind of person who liked to make noise. Then another truck came up behind me, honked twice, and passed. The driver slowed down as they went by, looking at my rig in a way that made me uneasy. I didn't think much of it at first, but it kept happening. 2 more cars, a pickup full of construction workers. Each one either honked or slowed down to stare. I checked my mirrors, thinking maybe one of my trailer doors had popped open or something was loose. Everything looked fine. I even pulled over once on the shoulder to do a walk around. The air was freezing, the wind biting through my jacket, but I went over every inch of the truck. The guard was still dented, a few stray hairs still clinging to the metal, but otherwise nothing unusual. No fluids, no smell, no blood. I shrugged it off, figuring people were just being weird, and got back in the cab. By the time I reached the Walmart loading dock in Wasilla, I'd almost forgotten about it. The warehouse guys were already waiting when I backed the trailer into position. The morning rush hadn't started yet, so the parking lot was mostly empty except for a few workers and early shoppers. I handed off the paperwork and waited while the forklift operator started unloading pallets. I was standing off to the side of the dock, sipping the last of my coffee and stretching my legs, when I noticed people gathering near the front of my truck. At first it was just 2 or 3 of them, pointing and murmuring. Then a few more. In the span of a minute, there were a dozen or more. Store workers, customers, even the forklift guy stopped what he was doing and walked over. I frowned, set my thermos down, and started walking toward the front of the truck. The closer I got, the quieter everyone became. That uneasy kind of silence where nobody wants to be the first to say what they're seeing. When I finally stepped around to the front of the cab, I understood why. There, tangled in the metal bars of the moose guard, was something small and dark and wet-looking. At first, my mind refused to process it. It just looked like a clump of torn fabric or maybe a pile of mud mixed with fur. Then the smell hit me. That raw metallic smell of blood and something else, something animal and wrong. It was a moose fetus, tiny, half-formed legs curled against its body, slick with fluids that had frozen in the cold air. One side of it was torn open, the skin a translucent gray, revealing veins and dark tissue beneath. Its head was twisted slightly, the eyes closed, lips drawn back just enough to expose little white teeth that hadn't yet grown in. It looked fragile in a way that made my stomach twist, like something that should never have been seen outside of its mother. I remember standing there completely still, my breath fogging in front of me. The crowd behind me didn't say a word. A couple of people had their hands over their mouths. Someone walked away quickly, covering their face. I just stared, trying to make sense of it. It must have happened when I hit the moose earlier. I hadn't realized it was pregnant, but the impact must have been just enough to cause it to expel the fetus. Somehow, impossibly, it had ended up tangled in the guard at the front of my truck. My brain ran through it all in flashes. The thud, the hair stuck to the bumper, the way the moose had bolted off into the trees. I thought I was lucky to only graze it. I hadn't known what I'd really done. The warehouse manager eventually came out, and the store workers cleared the area. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just kept staring. The manager told me they'd handle the cleanup, but I didn't stick around to watch. I walked behind the building, leaned against the wall, and tried to catch my breath. My hands were shaking. My throat felt tight. I'd driven trucks through snowstorms, over mountain passes, across icy bridges at night. I'd seen all kinds of wrecks, cars wrapped around poles, animals dead on the road. But nothing had ever hit me like that. It wasn't the gore. It was the realization that it had been alive inside its mother just an hour before I hit her. That I'd caused that without even knowing. The drive back to Anchorage later that day was quiet. I kept seeing it every time I blinked, the little body tangled in the bars, the frozen fluids glistening in the cold sunlight. The moose itself was probably still out there somewhere, limping through the trees, bleeding, confused. Maybe it died not long after. Maybe it survived. I didn't know which thought was worse. For weeks afterward, every time I got behind the wheel, I'd catch myself scanning the roadside more than usual. Every shadow between the trees looked like a moose about to step out. Every sudden movement made my stomach clench. Even after the company replaced the guard, I could still see where the metal had bent. I could still remember the smell. Strange how something can change the way you look at what's always been normal. I used to think of moose as just another hazard of the road. A danger, sure, but an ordinary one. After that day, they felt like something else entirely. I started noticing how quiet the forests got when one was nearby, how even the birds seemed to stop. There's a weight to those animals, a presence that fills the air long before you see them. I never hit another moose after that, but I saw plenty. Sometimes they'd appear in the distance, standing in the middle of the road like they were daring me to stop. Sometimes they'd just be silhouettes moving between the trees. Every time, I'd slow down and give them all the space they wanted. Years later, I left that job and moved on to something else. But I still remember that morning vividly. The pale light, the sound of the thud, the crowd gathered around my truck, the frozen little body tangled in the metal. It wasn't something you could forget, no matter how much you tried. Driving in Alaska teaches you a lot about respect. For the weather, for the terrain, for the sheer size of the world around you. But nothing ever drove it home quite like that moment did. You realize how fragile life really is. How something as simple as a split second on an icy road can turn into something you'll carry with you for the rest of your life. And every time I drive that same stretch of highway, even now, I can still feel it. The place where it happened, the cold morning air, the silence after the impact. I look at the tree line and wonder if that mother moose ever made it out of the woods that day. Or if she's buried somewhere near that road. Her calf's first and last moments forever caught against the front of a passing truck. My mom is a trucker, and this is her story. She's been driving across the country for more than 20 years. Long stretches of highway stitched together in her memory, like the seams of an endless quilt. She's the kind of person who doesn't scare easily. She's seen people flip cars right in front of her, driven through blizzards so thick you couldn't tell sky from road, and crossed desert highways so empty you start to wonder if you've left the world behind. But there are two stories she told me that still make her pause when she talks about them. One about the tarantulas in Arizona, and one about the tornado she outran in the Midwest. She was driving her rig through northern Arizona one late afternoon, hauling a full load of lumber. The sun was low, the light turning the pine trees orange and gold. It was one of those stretches of road that seems to go on forever. 2 lanes cutting through open land, nothing but forest and red dirt and sky. She'd been on the road since dawn, the hum of the tires a kind of steady rhythm that made time blur. When she saw something moving up ahead, she thought it was just wind kicking up leaves. From a distance, that's what it looked like. A brown shimmer across the asphalt, like dry leaves scattering in the breeze. That made her curious because there aren't many trees out there that shed like that. Northern Arizona is mostly evergreens, thick pines and tough shrubs. She watched it for a few more seconds as her rig rolled closer, the movement strange, uneven. The leaves weren't moving with the wind. They were crawling. When she finally reached them, the sight almost made her stomach turn. It wasn't leaves at all. It was tarantulas, thousands of them. The road in front of her was alive, thick with hairy brown bodies scuttling in every direction. They covered the asphalt from shoulder to shoulder, pouring out of the dry brush and across the road, like some kind of slow, rippling current. She hit the brakes, not slamming down but easing into them, trying not to lose control of the load behind her. The tires rolled over them and the sound was sickening, a series of faint crunching pops that she could feel through the steering wheel. The rig began to slide slightly, as if she were driving on wet gravel. Her heart jumped. She downshifted, eased off the gas, and held tight to the wheel. The tarantulas crushed beneath the tires made a slick mess, their bodies releasing an oily paste that smeared the road. It was like driving over mud that refused to grip. She kept her eyes locked forward, hands tense, forcing herself to keep calm. The swarm stretched for hundreds of yards and there was no way around it. By the time she cleared the mass, her truck was covered. The wheel wells, the bumper, the steps, all streaked with legs and guts. She glanced in her side mirrors and saw brown smears streaking down the silver paint. The noise had stopped, replaced by the sound of her own breathing and the low groan of the engine. When she finally reached a truck stop, she parked as far from the pumps as she could. She shut off the engine, exhaled, and just sat there for a long moment. Her co-driver, a guy she'd been on the road with for about a week, was asleep in the back bunk. Normally, it would have been his turn to fuel up while she rested, but she wasn't stepping foot outside after that. She nudged him awake and told him to take care of the fuel. He was irritated, still half asleep, mumbling under his breath as he climbed out. She watched from the driver's seat as he rounded the truck, stopped, and bent down to look at the wheel wells. He didn't move for several seconds. When he finally came back inside, he didn't say a word. He just sat down, eyes wide, and she could smell the faint, strange odor of crushed insects on his clothes. The memory stuck with her. She said she could never get the sound out of her head. The wet popping as the tires rolled over them. The way they seemed to move like one living mass. She told me later she found out that tarantulas in Arizona migrate in massive groups during mating season, sometimes crossing roads in the thousands. She had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that wasn't the only time she felt real fear out on the road. A few months later, she was hauling through the Midwest. Open flatlands where the sky stretches forever and storms come out of nowhere. The day had started calm, gray clouds hanging low but no wind. By afternoon, the radio started buzzing with weather alerts. Tornado warnings. She'd been through storms before, seen funnel clouds from a distance, but this one felt different. The air felt heavy, charged. The sky turned an unnatural greenish color, and the horizon looked bruised. She kept driving, scanning the sky. The wind began to pick up, pushing against the side of the trailer, rocking it slightly. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. Ahead of her, she saw other rigs pulling off to the shoulder. One by one, they were stopping, drivers deciding to take their chances by waiting it out. She thought about doing the same, but then she saw something that made the decision for her. About a quarter mile ahead, one of the rigs that had pulled over started to shake violently. The air around it swirled, and before she could fully understand what she was seeing, the entire truck lifted, actually lifted, off the ground. It rolled like a toy, thrown down the embankment and into a field. That was when she realized this storm wasn't something you could just wait out. She downshifted, pressed the pedal, and started to run from it. The sky behind her darkened to near black. The road ahead was the only thing that still looked normal, stretching straight and empty, but in her mirrors, she could see the faint outline of the funnel cloud dropping down from the clouds, twisting and growing. The wind howled, pushing against the trailer so hard she could feel the whole rig sway. The rain came next, sheets of it slamming against the windshield so thick she could barely see the yellow lines. Her wipers couldn't keep up. The radio crackled with static, then went dead. She gripped the wheel and focused on the road. The noise of the wind was deafening, like standing next to a jet engine. She saw debris flying, branches, chunks of wood, pieces of fencing, and one by one they began hitting the truck, clanging against the metal like stones. She thought she might die out there. She was sure of it, but she couldn't stop. Stopping meant giving the storm a chance to catch her. She pushed the truck harder than she ever had, the engine roaring under the strain. At one point, she saw a dark shape moving across the field beside her. The tornado itself, moving fast, twisting up dirt and grass and chunks of what used to be barns. Finally, she spotted a Walmart sign ahead, off one of the exits. She didn't think twice. She took the ramp too fast, the trailer fishtailing behind her as she fought to keep it straight. She pulled into the lot, tires screeching, and ran from the cab as soon as she stopped. The sky was roaring now, the air hot and cold all at once, the kind of pressure that makes your ears pop. She made it into the store where people were shouting and pointing toward the windows. Someone led her and a group of customers down a stairwell into the basement. The walls vibrated. It sounded like the earth was being ripped apart above them. Dust fell from the ceiling, lights flickered, and everyone just stood there, frozen, waiting for it to stop. When it finally did, there was silence, so sudden it felt unreal. She said it was the strangest quiet she'd ever heard. They climbed the stairs and opened the door to what was left of the store. The ceiling was gone. The walls were half collapsed. You could see daylight through the torn-open roof. Shopping carts were scattered across the parking lot, twisted metal and insulation hanging from the rafters. The smell of rain and dirt filled the air. Her truck was still there somehow. Covered in debris, one mirror cracked but still standing. Around it, the parking lot looked like a junkyard. A couple of other trucks had flipped, their trailers ripped open like soda cans, She didn't drive for a few days after that. She stayed in a cheap motel nearby, watching footage of the tornado on the news. It had ripped straight through the town and destroyed half of it. People were lucky to be alive. She said that's the thing about trucking. You spend most of your time alone, watching the road roll by. Nothing but empty miles and small towns. 90% of it is boredom, but the other 10%. That's the part that makes you realize how thin the line is between normal and disaster. One moment you're cruising along under a calm sky, and the next the world decides to remind you who's in charge. When she tells those stories, she always ends them the same way. She says that every mile on the road teaches you something, even the bad ones. That night in Arizona taught her how small people really are, compared to the things that crawl and swarm across the earth. That day in the Midwest taught her how fragile a machine feels when nature decides to test it. And even now, after all these years, when she's sitting at a diner off the interstate, sipping coffee before another long haul, she still glances out the window at the horizon like she's watching for something. She says she doesn't scare easy, but sometimes, when the wind starts to pick up or the clouds take on that dark, strange color, she can feel that same tightness in her chest. The same one she felt when the tarantulas moved under her wheels, or when the tornado chased her across the plains. She says that's what the road does to you. It humbles you. It gives you stories you'll never forget, whether you want them or not. And when she's home, sitting still for a few days, she says it almost feels too quiet, like the world's holding its breath before the next strange, terrifying thing decides to show itself out there on the open road. I used to drive Interstate 80 between San Francisco and Cheyenne, Wyoming a lot. It's a long, monotonous stretch of highway that cuts through miles of nothingness. Rolling hills, plains, desert, mountains, and the kind of lonely rest stops that feel like they've been forgotten by time. Depending on traffic, weather, or how many times I stopped, it usually took between 16 and 20 hours. I drove it often enough that I could recognize the landmarks. The same crumbling gas stations, the faded billboards, the lonely motels that glowed like dying embers on the side of the road. I liked the drive for the solitude, the emptiness, the time to think. But over time, I started to realize that the emptiness on that stretch of road wasn't peaceful. It was something else, something that made you feel small and exposed. The first strange thing that ever happened to me out there was at one of those nameless rest stops somewhere in Nevada, maybe halfway between Reno and Salt Lake City. I had been driving for hours, probably close to midnight, and I was running on caffeine and bad gas station snacks. The road was quiet. No headlights behind me, no taillights ahead, just the endless sound of wind and tires. When I saw the blue rest stop sign, I pulled in just to stretch my legs and take a piss. The place was deserted. A couple of vending machines flickered beside the bathrooms, one of them buzzing like a dying fly. The air was cold and dry, and even though I was in the middle of nowhere, I could smell diesel faintly, probably drifting from the highway. I walked into the men's bathroom expecting the usual smell of disinfectant, maybe one flickering light. Instead, I opened the door and froze. On the tile floor were three huge bearded men. All of them were naked from the waist down, tangled together on the filthy tile in what I can only describe as some kind of sexual daisy chain. For a split second, I thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion, but then two of them looked right at me. Their faces were blank, like they didn't even feel embarrassed. One of them didn't even stop what he was doing. The other's eyes went wide, and I just muttered something stupid, sorry, and backed out. I walked straight to my car and got in. My heart wasn't racing or anything. I was just confused. The only thought I had, looping in my head over and over, was how filthy that floor must have been. The smell of ammonia and piss still clung to my clothes when I got back on the highway. I didn't tell anyone about that for a long time. It was just too bizarre, and somehow it felt wrong to even bring up. But that wasn't the strangest thing that happened to me on I-80. The second time was a few months later. I was driving back east again around 2 in the morning. My buddy had come along for the ride this time to split the driving. It was a cold night, the kind where the air feels heavy and frost forms on the edges of the windshield. The highway was nearly empty, just us, the stars, and the hum of the tires. Somewhere past Elko, the car started making this grinding noise. It was faint at first, then got louder, like something metal was scraping against the ground. I slowed down, thinking maybe I'd picked up a branch or a piece of debris. There was a rest stop coming up, one of the newer ones with those big white streetlights that make everything look pale and sterile. I pulled in, parked near the bathrooms, and woke my buddy. We both got out, our breath clouding in the cold air. That's when we heard it, a sound that made both of us stop. It sounded like a child crying, faint, distant, but clear. Just this small, broken sobbing that carried across the lot. It was coming from the direction of the bathrooms. There were no other cars in the lot, no trucks, no RVs, nothing. The wind wasn't strong enough to carry sound that far, but the crying was unmistakable. It wasn't loud or panicked. It was slow and weak, like a kid who'd been crying for a long time and was running out of energy. My first thought was that maybe a kid had been left behind, or maybe something worse. We'd heard enough stories about trafficking and abductions along the highway that it didn't seem impossible. I remember feeling tense, not scared exactly, but alert. We grabbed our flashlights and started walking toward the bathrooms. The sound got clearer as we got closer. It was definitely coming from the women's side. The sobbing echoed softly, rising and falling. I could almost make out breaths between the sounds, like whoever it was trying to calm themselves down, and couldn't. We stepped inside. The light was dim, just one of those overhead fluorescents buzzing and flickering. The air smelled faintly like bleach, but underneath that there was something else. Something stale and damp, like water sitting too long in the pipes. The crying didn't stop when we entered. It was still there, right in front of us, but there was nobody. No movement, no shadow. The stalls were all open. I checked under each one, expecting to see a pair of shoes or maybe a small figure curled up in a corner. Nothing. The sound kept going. We turned on the main lights. Every corner was empty. We even opened the trash bin, thinking maybe an animal had gotten stuck in there somehow. Still nothing. It was like the sound was in the air itself. It wasn't muffled or distant. It was right there, all around us, like it was coming from the walls. I remember the way it reverberated slightly, like a recording being played in a big, empty hall. My buddy started checking the ceiling vents, and I looked under the sinks, behind the trash cans, even along the edges of the walls. Put my ear close to the tiled floor at one point, and I swear it sounded even louder, like it was coming from underneath. Then my buddy climbed up onto one of the stalls and reached the top window, a small vented one that was half open. The crying sounded a bit louder near it, so he pulled it closed. The sound stopped, instantly, like cutting off a switch. We both just stood there for a few seconds. He opened it again. Nothing. The crying didn't come back. The air felt heavier suddenly, and we just looked at each other. I didn't know what to say, and he didn't either. Then, without warning, the window slammed shut by itself. Hard. The sound of it hitting the frame echoed through the empty room. We both froze. There wasn't any wind. The air in that bathroom was still. I remember feeling the skin on my arms tighten, like my body just knew something was wrong. We didn't say a word. We didn't even look at each other. We just walked fast out of that bathroom and straight to the car. By the time we got outside, the crying started again. It wasn't faint anymore. It was louder, sharper. Still sounded like a child, but strained, almost mechanical. Like it was being forced out of something that wasn't human. I didn't wait to see where it came from. I started the car and we were gone in seconds. I didn't look back at the bathroom, but in the rearview mirror I saw the lights flicker as we pulled out. We drove in silence for miles. The grinding noise was still there under the car, rhythmic, like something scraping metal against asphalt. It felt like it was mocking the sound of our tires. I didn't want to stop again, but I also didn't want to risk damaging the car. So about half an hour later, we pulled into a Flying J truck stop, one of the 24-hour ones with a diner and big rigs lined up along the lot. There were a couple of truckers leaning against their trailers smoking, but otherwise it was quiet. We parked under the lights and got down to check the car. The sound had been bothering me for hours now, and I was hoping to find something simple. Maybe a wire, a piece of metal, anything. I crouched down and shone my flashlight underneath. That's when I saw it. A small red and silver piece of metal jammed between the undercarriage and the road. It was thin, flat, wedged so tightly I couldn't pull it out by hand. My buddy tried to, but it wouldn't budge. I kicked at it a few times and managed to bend it enough that it stopped scraping the ground. It looked like something from a kid's tricycle, the little platform on the back where another kid could stand. I didn't think much of it then. I figured it had just flown off someone's car or trailer and got stuck under mine. A week later, when I took the car to get serviced, I asked my mechanic to take it out. He handed it to me afterward, a bent, scratched red and silver piece of metal with flakes of asphalt and rust clinging to it. He said it was definitely from a tricycle, probably one that had been hit or crushed. I didn't know what to say. I still don't know what to make of it. It's been years since that drive, and I've gone back and forth across that stretch of highway many times since then. I've seen all sorts of strange things out there. People sleeping in their cars at 3 a.m., in the middle of nowhere, abandoned trucks with the doors wide open, stray animals crossing the highway where there shouldn't be any. But nothing ever stuck with me like that night. My buddy later emailed me about it, saying he thought it might have been coyotes. He'd heard them near a cabin once and said their calls could sound like kids laughing or crying. He thought maybe the sound had carried through the air, or through the pipes connected to the drains. Maybe the wind caught the vent and made it slam shut. It's possible. That explanation makes sense. I want to believe it. But when I think back to that night, to the way the crying seemed to fill the air like it was trapped inside the room with us, to how it stopped instantly when that window closed, I can't shake the feeling that something about it wasn't just sound echoing through the desert. There was something too precise, too focused about where it came from, like it was aware of us. Sometimes when I drive at night and I pull into those rest stops again, I catch myself listening, just standing there, waiting, trying to hear something under the hum of the lights or the rustle of the wind. I never do, but every time I hear a grinding sound from my car, or when the wind whistles through the vents, there's a part of me that goes right back to that bathroom, that night on I-80, and that faint sound of a child crying in the dark desert air. My trucking days were some of the roughest years of my life. People think long-haul trucking sounds like freedom. The open road, the miles stretching out under your tires, no boss breathing down your neck. But it's not like that. It's exhaustion, loneliness, and weird things that happen in the middle of the night, when you've been awake for 30 hours straight and the world stops feeling real. You start seeing things out there, even if you don't believe in that kind of stuff. You start to feel like the road itself is alive, like it remembers you. I used to think I was tough, but some of the things I saw during those years still stick to me like tar. It was about 3 in the morning when that one happened. I was heading south on I-75, somewhere deep into Georgia, pulling a light load of auto parts bound for Tampa. I'd been driving since noon the previous day. I should have stopped, but I was trying to make good time and stay ahead of schedule. The sky was clear that night, stars everywhere, and the air outside was heavy and warm. The cab smelled like coffee, diesel, and old sweat. The hum of the tires on the asphalt had become a rhythm that felt like it could hypnotize you if you let it. It was one of those long, empty stretches of interstate where nothing exists but the soft orange glow of the occasional streetlight and the endless line of reflectors along the road. No cars, no cops, no towns. Just that black river of highway flowing south. My CB was quiet, no chatter from other drivers. I remember tapping the steering wheel in time with the sound of the tires, trying to keep my mind awake. That night I kept thinking about my old trainer, Charlie. He was the kind of man who believed that the road had spirits. He'd say things like, "There's stuff out here you don't see until you've driven enough miles for it to notice you." He had stories about strange lights, about voices on the CB that didn't belong to anyone, about trucks that followed you but never showed up in the mirrors. I never put much faith in it, but earlier that day I'd called him just to catch up. He told me another one of his crazy stories about being chased through Florida by a green glowing truck that disappeared into thin air. He swore it was real, and something about the way he told it stuck with me all afternoon. So when I saw that light behind me, it hit me harder than it should have. It was just a faint glow at first, maybe 2 miles back, but I noticed right away that it was different. Most headlights fade in and out over the dips in the road, but this one stayed steady. It wasn't bouncing, and it was brighter than anything I'd ever seen out there. Too bright. I kept glancing at my mirrors, watching it, thinking maybe it was a car with high beams on or a state trooper with a spotlight. But the color was wrong, more white than yellow, almost like a welder's torch. I remember tightening my grip on the wheel. I was already on edge from lack of sleep and from Charlie's story, and something about that light made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. It was getting closer, fast. I kept checking the mirror every few seconds, and each time I looked, it was closer. At first, it was just a glow. Then it became 2 huge, blinding orbs bearing down on me. The thing was moving like nothing I'd ever seen on the highway. My foot eased off the accelerator as instinct kicked in. I was doing about 70, and whatever that thing was, it was gaining like I was standing still. I could feel my pulse thudding in my hands. It took less than 30 seconds for it to close the distance. The light filled the mirrors completely, bright enough that I had to squint and lean forward. The reflection of it flashed across the dash, washing the cab in white. I rolled down my window and leaned out a little to see if it was an emergency vehicle, or maybe some idiot in a modded car. Then in one blinding rush of heat and noise, it roared past me. The sound was enormous, wind screaming, tires howling, and the heat that blasted through my open window hit my face like I'd opened an oven. For a second, I thought something had exploded. The backwash from it rocked my rig hard enough that I had to correct the wheel. My heart was hammering in my chest. That's when I saw what it was. It was a hay hauler, a long flatbed loaded high with bales of hay, and the entire trailer was on fire. Not just smoking or smoldering, but fully engulfed. Every bale was a burning mass of orange flame, sparks trailing behind like a comet tail. The driver's cab was somehow untouched, shining silver in the headlights as it screamed past me at what had to be over 100 miles an hour. The firelight lit up the road, the guardrails, even the treetops as it thundered ahead. I just sat there for a few seconds, too stunned to even move. The smell of burning hay hit me next, thick and sweet and awful, mixed with the faint tang of diesel. The glow of the fire faded into the distance ahead, and all I could think was how fast he must have been going. Finally, my body caught up with my brain. I grabbed the mic of the CB and shouted for him, my voice shaking. I tried to warn him, tell him his load was burning. I got nothing but static for a moment. Then a slow, even voice came back, calm as could be. He said he knew. He said he was just letting it burn off. He figured if he kept his speed up, the flames wouldn't reach the cab. That answer froze me worse than the sight of the fire. I didn't even know what to say. I just sat there listening to the hiss of static after he signed off. For a long while after that, I couldn't get the image out of my head. The long streak of flame moving down the highway like some burning beast, the way it seemed to eat the dark as it went. I drove the next 100 miles, barely blinking, every shape in the dark ahead looking like something else catching fire. When I pulled off at the next rest stop, I sat there in the driver's seat for 10 minutes with my hands shaking. People who've never driven those roads at night don't understand what it does to your head. You're out there alone, mile after mile. Nothing but the drone of the engine and the hum of the tires. After a while, your thoughts stop feeling like thoughts. They're just noise. You start remembering things you don't want to. You start imagining things in the mirrors, things that aren't there. That night made me realize how thin the line is between being alert and being lost in your own head. I didn't see that hay hauler again. I don't know if he made it. There was no mention of it on the news or the radio the next day. No burned wreck on the side of the road when I came back up north. Maybe he pulled off and put it out. Maybe he didn't. Maybe it burned down to nothing somewhere off an exit ramp. I guess I'll never know. But that wasn't the only strange thing that ever happened to me out there. The worst part is that what scared me most wasn't the fire, or the speed, or even the idea of a man calmly driving a burning rig. It was how normal it all felt in that moment. Like it was just another part of the road. Just another thing that happens when you drive long enough. The next day, when I stopped for fuel, I caught myself staring at the scorched bugs on my windshield. They were tiny black smears, but the way the morning sun hit them reminded me of that wall of fire. I remember wiping them off with my sleeve and feeling this weird sense of relief, like I was erasing proof of something that shouldn't have happened. A few weeks later, I found myself back on the same stretch of I-75, again late at night. I'd stopped at a truck stop outside Macon to grab coffee, and when I stepped out, I caught a faint whiff of burnt hay. It was probably just the wind carrying some smoke from a nearby field, but for a second, it felt like the road was reminding me, like it wanted me to remember that not everything that burns gets found. That was years ago now. I've left trucking behind. My back still aches sometimes from sitting too long, and my knuckles are scarred from working the couplers and ratchets in freezing weather. But every now and then, when I'm driving late at night on an empty road, I catch myself checking the mirrors a little too often. I'll see a bright light cresting a hill behind me, and for just a second I'll brace myself, half expecting to see that flaming trailer roaring up from the dark again. I tell people that trucking gave me a lifetime of stories, and that's true. Some of them are funny, some are just strange. But that night on I-75 will always be the one that sticks. It wasn't just what I saw. It was what it made me feel. That mix of fear, awe, and disbelief that only the road can give you. The realization that there's no real safety out there. Just motion and noise and fire in the distance. And maybe that's what all those miles were about. Learning that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but people like that driver, so used to danger that they can watch their world burn behind them and just keep going.